Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement for the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk with activist Tamara Lanier. As many of you probably know, one of our fall exhibitions is Carrie Mae Weems, The Usual Suspects, which is on view in our Walsh Gallery through December 18th. It's free and open to the public, and you can visit the show from Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. In 1995, Carrie Mae Weems did another exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City that was entitled "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried." And this used daguerreotype photographs taken of enslaved men and women that were commissioned by Harvard professor Louis Agassiz in support of his ideas of racial hierarchy. That show, even though it is not the show that is on view at Fairfield University right now, is the connecting thread that led us to tonight's speaker. Tamara K. Lanier is a direct descendant of two of the enslaved individuals in the daguerreotypes that Carrie Mae Weems used in that project, Renty and Delia. And in 2019, with the assistance of civil rights attorneys Benjamin L. Crump and Michael Koskoff, she filed a landmark reparations lawsuit against Harvard University to reclaim those images and asked the court to consider who should own the rights to the violence of the past. Tamara K. Lanier is a tireless champion for truth and justice. A 27-year veteran of the state of Connecticut judicial branch, one of her passions is to eradicate racial and ethnic disparities in Connecticut's criminal justice system and to put an end to the ugly practice of racial profiling. She has a long and distinguished record of public service and social advocacy, and among her past affiliations are the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the City of Norwich Ethics Commission, and the Abraham Lincoln Forum of Southeastern Connecticut. She's an active member of the ACLU of Connecticut, Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Board, and the Vice President of the New London NAACP. She was also appointed by Governor Ned Lamont to Connecticut's first Hate Crime Advisory Council. Lanier has been the recipient of numerous awards for her activism and social justice work. In 2015, she was named Woman of the Year by the Connecticut General Assembly's Commission on Afro-American Affairs. In 2016, she received the Connecticut Commission of Human Rights and Opportunities Leaders and Legends Award, and in 2019, the Inspirational Women's Award. Please join me in welcoming Tamara K. Lanier.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. And I want to also say to the Fairfield University Art Museum, to Michelle DiMarzo and Jessica Lizotte, thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving me this opportunity to share my story with your audience and with your students. And without further ado, I'd like to just go into the PowerPoint presentation because there is a lot of information and I want to make sure we have time for questions after. This is an image of my great-great-great-grandfather, and his name was Renty Taylor, and he was referred to by his family, his children, and his family and loved ones as Papa Renty. And from the onset, what I wanted to do is to clarify or to confirm for people that there's no speculation or supposition as to whether or not I am the descendant of this man, the direct descendant of this man. And I have worked with the best genealogist in the world. Currently, the woman who completed Michelle Obama's genealogy, she's also the person who has worked with Henry Gates on his show, Who Do You Think You Are? She is the one who says, and she has said this publicly, that I am who I say I am, that there is no doubt in her mind that I am Renty's granddaughter. So for the purposes of tonight or any further discussion, it's not anything that anyone should wonder or ponder over as to whether or not I was able to prove my lineage. It has been certified. I meet and far exceed the legal burden of proof to show a kinship with the man in this picture. That's my Papa Renty. The next slide is a clip from when we filed the complaint. Our attorneys met with the press and were discussing the case. And I want to share that so you have an overview of what the case is about.
That's what we are fighting for. So not only is this about the descendants of Renty, but it's also about the descendants of all black people who descended from slavery.
There's one of the things, this is Mike Koskoff, one of the things that Harvard is doing is perpetuating one of the basic facets of slavery, and that was the disruption of the family. And the disruption of the family was very important to the institution of slavery because it was what allowed them to perpetuate without any really effective organization. And what Harvard is doing is consciously interfering with the familial ties that Tamara Lanier has with Renty. And they know it. I mean, they've got the evidence. They know that they're related. This is not accidental. What they're really trying to do, by the way, they're doing this for a reason. And that is to cover up the role of the person who was responsible for taking these images, whose name was Louis Agassiz, who was a celebrity scientist from Harvard, who Harvard promoted, who Harvard set forth. He was a bigot. He was a bigot against blacks. He was a bigot against Jews. He was a bigot against Irish. He was just a free
Equal opportunity
bigot. And he was a professor at Harvard and is to this day praised by Harvard on their website as being the leading scientist of his time, whereas Charles Darwin, who was the leading scientist of his time, called Agassiz's theories rubbish.
So what and I neglected to talk about the title of my slide, which is Genealogical Trees Don't Flourish Among Slaves. And it's a quote taken from Frederick Douglass's autobiography that he wrote sometime in the early 1850s. But, I think about how prophetic Douglass must have been in that moment to be able to look down the road and see the impact on slavery, the impact of slavery on slave descendants or the descendants of the enslaved. And what this story also encapsulates is how difficult it is, particularly for people of color, to trace their ancestry and to trace their lineage. And it was done so. The difficulty was created by the destruction of the family and separating families. As I often say, when slave families were broken apart, families didn't get postcards later to say, I'm no longer in South Carolina, I'm now in Alabama. They never saw their family again. And so what I was blessed with the good fortune of having was an oral history. And I say that because when I talk about the blessings associated with that is there's this thing in genealogical research called the brick wall. And it's when you trace back and you're at the 1900s, it's next to impossible to continue tracing back because the records don't exist, because of slavery, because of the Civil War and the burning of buildings and records. So all you have left for the most part is your oral history. And if you don't have a sound oral history, you're not going to be able to navigate very far beyond the early 1900s, late 1800s. The picture that we're looking at now is an image of the Sankofa bird. It's an African proverb that embraces the concept of the past reaching out to the present. And it's a foretelling and prophetic message of the past that cries out that we never forget where we come from. I also like to say what this bird reminds me is that I can't move forward until I go back and recover what is rightfully mine. And that is when we're talking about the daguerreotype itself. Next slide. This is an image of my mother. I refer to her as the keeper of our family story, the keeper of our oral history. And there's also an image of, the second image is of my mother, myself, and an image of Papa Renty, which my daughter, who's the graphic design person in the family, but she imported all of these images and created one. But I share this because I referred to my mom as the real MVP of the story. Not only did she not have the advantage of ancestry or 23andMe or any census information to talk about where our families migrated, who the players were, who the relatives were, who the cousins, who the grandparents were. And doing the research and tracing back, it was almost as if my mom was reading from the census or was reading from some official record. Her oral history of what happened aligns very closely. It aligns perfectly with the official records, as if she was reading from them when she was telling us. And so my mom, she was a retired teacher who migrated to Connecticut in the early 40s, 1940s. She met my dad, who was stationed at the Groton subbase in Groton, Connecticut, and settled here. But she grew up in a rural part of Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. And she grew up with her extended family. My mother was raised in the household with her grandfather, who was born a slave. His name was also Renty, and he would tell my mother stories, and he would tell her to always remember, never forget. And so according to the family story, these stories about Papa Renty were passed down from generation to generation to generation. And there were stories about who he was and how important he was to his children. And so just as Renty, the man in the image, told his son, that son, whose name was Renty, told his son, who was my mom's grandfather, who told her, who told me. So it's a straight line of communication. It's a straight line of lineage and descendancy that starts with this man. And I'm sitting here today in 2021 telling his story. And, you know, the other important thing that I want people to understand, you know, we talk about slavery as if it was this far ago incident in history. I'm not that many generations removed from slavery. My mother was raised in a household with a person who was born a slave. And she never forgot that. And she made sure that we understood and never forgot that too. Next. And this is kind of a makeshift chart. The man at the top on the left is the man in the image, Congo Renty. He had a son, Renty. And that was my great-great-grandfather. He had a son he named Renty. That was my mother's grandfather, or my great-great-grandfather. This man, to keep it, so it is very confusing to follow because everyone is named after the generation before them. I called them Renty 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so Renty 3 had a son, and you can see it's probably the fourth one in, I believe, is Renty. But Renty 3 had a son who I call Renty 4. My mother's brother was also named Renty. I call him Renty 5. But I share that to say how important this man was to his children. Every generation after him named their children after him. And so it was important not only to remember who we were and where we came from, but also to keep a part of his legacy alive by naming children after him. Next. And so, you know, my mom, she would always talk, when we were small, when I was a young child, I remember conversations where she would say to us, always remember, you're African, you're Indian. Always remember, we're Taylors, not Thompsons. My mother knew who when Renty 3 was my mom referred to it as a sale, but the records show that at the death of the slaveholder Benjamin Franklin Taylor, Renty III was gifted to his daughter as in a probate matter, but his name changed from Taylor to Thompson. And she would say, always remember, we're Taylors, not Thompsons. She knew that. She believed it to be that Renty III was sold. But what the records show is that Renty was separate. Renty and his mother, Tina, were separated from their family as a gift. They were gifted to Benjamin Franklin Taylor's daughter. But she would tell these stories about who Papa Renty was, and it was important that we always remember and never forget. Next. Some of the things that she would tell us about Papa Renty. One thing that she was most proud of, and she would often talk about, was his literacy. That he not only was educated and taught himself to read, but he would teach others. And he would do this at a time when it was illegal to do, at his own peril to do, but he would do it anyway. And she would say things like, if you had a desire to read, Renty would teach you. That he also was a very religious person who read and taught from the Bible and who would sneak away to hold private secret Bible or private religious ceremonies. And one of the things that she was most proud of is what a pillar he was to the society that he lived in and that everyone respected him. And she would talk about, you know, not only the respect that Renty enjoyed, but that there was no shame in slavery. She talked about in growing up amongst elders and ancestors who were still living, who were born slaves, they were respected, they were revered. And my mom would often say that there was no shame in slavery, and that, you know, those that lived amongst them at that time, those that had been born a slave, were people who were celebrated, who were elevated and respected. Next. So this, you know, this next part of the discussion is about some of the facts of the case, like certain things, you know, when we talk about, people speculate, but when I talk about my lineage, it's because I'm using official records, government documents, death records, cemetery records, official things, not speculation as to, you know, this might have happened or this can. I'm referring to and gathering information from official government records. Next. I share this slide to only give context to not only showing from how long, how you know, from the point I was a child until my mom passed away, that she talked about this. This is on the far left is the cover of a book from these roots that's in the middle. But my mom's cousin had written a book tracing my mom's ancestry on her maternal side back to this woman who was called Big Mammy, who came to the United States from Africa as a slave. My mom's goal was always to trace her paternal side back to Africa, starting with Papa Renty. This book on the right is something my daughter, who's now 36, her very first book report in her life, she wrote about Papa Renty. Her and my mom sat down and they wrote the book, and she dedicated it to her little sister, who was probably like 1 or 2 at the time, so that she will always know where she came from. And I share this to say, this is not only with me in how I was reared and to embrace who my ancestors were and the stories about Papa Renty, but as soon as my children were old enough, my mom started sharing this information with them and to document the story. Next. This is an interesting slide. My mom, you know, again, throughout my childhood, throughout my children's childhood, talked about Papa Renty and our ancestors and our ancestry. And it was when she became ill, it became more and more important to her. One of the things she started doing is saying to me, I want you to write this down. I want you to create a family tree, like the little yellow book that her cousin had done. She wanted to do a book the same. I want you to do this. When my mom became terminally ill, It was all she talked about. She would sit in when we were in critical care, she would be talking about, I want you to document this. She would be talking about Papa Renty. When she was in the nursing homes, we would sit and she would say, I want you to write this down. And we would write these things down. And we did that because it comforted her, because talking about her elders and Papa Renty and our family story made her feel good in the moment, and it distracted her from her failing health. My children would go in sometimes and say, Grandma, tell us that story about Papa Renty. And my mom would settle into her storytelling mode, and she would just, you know, a peace would come over her. And so we encouraged her to talk about it because it made her happy in the moment. But to be honest, I've never done genealogy. I didn't know how to do it. And we weren't planning on writing a book. We were just trying to make my mom happy. And so the gentleman in this picture, his name is Rich Morrison, and he owns an ice cream shop in downtown Norwich where I live. And I would go there regularly to pick up a salad for lunch. When my mom passed, I had so much guilt and remorse about promising her that I would write this genealogical tree and create the tree and document the story. And I stopped in one day and I had been out for a walk and I shared with Rich, I said, you know, I promised my mom I would do this genealogy project and I don't know how to do it. And so he said to me, he said, write what you know down and I will do the research. He said, I love doing this stuff. And Rich he was, I would say probably then in his 80s, maybe not quite 80, but he was elderly and somewhat feeble. And we're talking 2010 at a time when many seniors or elders didn't even know how to turn a computer on, let alone navigate the internet. So I'm like, okay, Rich, I didn't really have confidence in him helping me. So I paid for my ice cream. I talked to him about Papa Renty. I mentioned to him about he was African born and some of the children's names. He said, write down what you know. And Rich and I at that time, we talked almost, when we saw each other, but we didn't know who we were. I didn't know his name. He didn't know mine. We exchanged our information and I left. And I didn't go right back. But when I came in to the shop, he greeted me, threw his hands in the air. He says, where have you been? He said, I found your Papa Renty on the internet. I'm like, yeah, right, Rich. What is my Papa Renty doing on the internet? Again, we're talking about 2010 and information and, like, okay. So we exchanged information. He sent me an email, which I went back to work and I completely didn't give it another thought until later that evening when I got home. And when I got home, I opened up the email and the first thing I read about was Harvard, Louis Agassiz and scientific racism. He had put a whole dossier together for me. And I remember being shocked and dismayed by what I was reading. And then I clicked on the image and opened it and I'm like, oh my God. And I'll never forget that moment because I'm sitting kind of where I was sitting now. And I called my girls in and I said, this is Papa Renty. I immediately knew that this was the Papa Renty that my mom had talked about. There was something about the way our eyes connected. And so my oldest daughter, she remarked, she says, from the stories that Grandma had told, I imagined a person in my head. She had created an image of Papa Renty, who was a person 10 feet tall. And so, but she says, Mom, there's so much family resemblance there. And so I knew in that moment that that was my Papa Renty. And then, what I started to do is started to build the research to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Next. This is an important document. This is a document taken from the slaveholder's father. Benjamin Franklin Taylor was the slaveholder. His father, Colonel Thomas Taylor, at his death gifted Renty and his children to Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And I say this document is important for two things. Firstly, it let me know that there was, from my oral history, I knew that Renty III's father was Renty. And so when and this is in 1834, I knew that Renty III wasn't born until 1850s, early 1850s. So I'm like, oh, there's another Renty here. So it let me know that the Renty who was Renty III's father was the Renty in this daguerreotype, in this document, who refers to him as Big Renty. But one of the early conversations in the, actually it came out, it was developed when the reporter was doing the investigation for the New York Times story. And at this time, Harvard is now writing a book. We'll talk about that later, but they knew of this story at this time, but they were publishing a book about actually tracing the people in the daguerreotypes, but they were going in a completely different direction and ignoring the information about my ancestors, who they were and how they lived. And they created this false narrative. But what the person who wrote the book, he pointed to, on the right-hand side, there is Big Renty, Eve, and Creasy. And on the left-hand side, about halfway down, you see a family grouping with Renty, Eddie, Hector, Molly, Caesar, Delia, and July. So the person associated with Harvard who was a part of writing the book, said these are two separate and independent families. And so what I explained is, no, they're not. And typically what you have in Black families, and not necessarily limited to Black families, that when you have like a Big Renty, it stands to reason that there is a little Renty, or that Big Renty is the father and the other Renty is the child. And those are things that typically happen in Black families. But what was more important is the next document. What I showed them is, now my Renty III's mother was named Tina. And we knew under item 9, to my daughter, Annie W. Messick, I give and bequeath the following slaves in their increase: Miriam, Tina, Betsy, and Nora. And then he goes on to say, to my daughter, Sally Coles Taylor, I give and bequeath the following slaves in their increase: July, brother of Eve. And so that's important because it connects the two families. On the right side of that slave index was July. July is the last person named in that family grouping, but Eve is under Big Renty. So what Benjamin Franklin Taylor was saying in his own words is that Eve on the right and July on the left are brothers and sisters. So I was, again, trying to show Harvard, it was one of the things I said is, how much more easy would their job have been if they had just talked to me or reached out or responded to me or took the opportunity to look at my research. They would have all of this information, but they never did. After my many requests to sit down with them and go over the research so that I could show them that I'm actually Renty's daughter, we haven't had that sit down yet. Next. This young lady, I attribute to her probably, she was so instrumental in helping me pin down my lineage. I can't thank Roshiver enough. And during the research, I did everything. I went everywhere. I even went to Switzerland, but I traveled. Anytime I saw that there was research about the daguerreotypes or research about, or a discussion about slavery in South Carolina, I went no matter where it was. And I was fortunate because a lot of the colleges nearby where I live have great Black history programs and great seminars where they talk about this, and they bring in really talented people to discuss it. But I was also calling South Carolina museums, libraries, colleges, clerk's office, trying to find the Taylor children, because I knew, based on what I'm seeing in the wills, that my family followed Benjamin Franklin Taylor's children. So I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to piece this puzzle together and find my ancestors and find my family, I have to follow the Taylor children and where they went. And so I called everywhere in South Carolina, but Rose was the one who was helpful. And what she actually did, she first was able to find a telephone number for this man you see here, Dr. Edmund Taylor. He is the great-great-grandson of the slaveholder Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And so one afternoon, Rose and I are talking, and I said, I really need to find and talk to a Taylor descendant. And she said, I found this number. And so she said, I asked if she would call. She says, I'm not calling. So I had to call. But nonetheless, I called Dr. Taylor's home. And I wasn't really sure what to expect. I didn't know if they would hang up on me or be rude to me. But the person who answered was his daughter, Mary. We had a very pleasant conversation. And out of that conversation was an invitation from Dr. Taylor for me to come and visit for the weekend. And so I remember hanging up and telling my girls, I was like, hey, we're going to South Carolina to spend the weekend with the family of the man who enslaved our ancestors. And so I couldn't get my girls to go, but it was important for me that I go. And it was a trip that I'll never forget. I had an amazing time. I learned so much. This is Dr. Taylor and his wife, and I think that is Sally Coles Taylor in the image that we stood in front of. But the next slide, this is Dr. Taylor talking. Why? And I did record that, and it's somewhat long, but what was important about that was I was sitting there, and as he was talking, I was hearing things from the slaveholder's perspective, which were actually the same things that my mom had told me coming from the enslaved person's perspective. Dr. Taylor talked about some of the slaves could read. They knew that. He talked about, the slaves in particular that they were fond of. Some of them were preachers. One of the things that he said was that the Taylors operated an underground railroad to Ohio. My mom, I have her recorded as talking about this, had an enslaved ancestor who she talks about who went on the Underground Railroad to Ohio. And so I was hearing the same stories from the slaveholder and from the enslaved person. And they were coming, like I said, from these different perspectives. And it was really quite a surreal experience. The next picture, one of the things he told me, he says, you're sitting at a table that was hand carved by the Taylor family slave. And the dishes that we were eating from were Benjamin Franklin Taylor's dishes. So I got really lost in that moment because immediately what came to mind is what I read is that my ancestor was the carpenter, was the Taylor family carpenter. So he's talking, but I'm stuck on, did my ancestor carve these tables and chairs that I'm sitting at? So I was just really, really amazed. And so when I told him that my ancestor was the Taylor family carpenter, he wanted me to take a picture and to see the detailed woodwork and how amazing, the woodwork was, and just that, how sturdy and durable these things were that are 200 years old. And so I was just amazed. And it was a really, really surreal experience. But again, there was so much there about, learning confirmation of what my mom had told me, as well as learning even more about the talent and the mastery of my ancestors. Next. So the truth is in the ground. And so my friend and I had gone to Canterbury to at Prudence Candle Museum. There was a speaker from Central Connecticut University. He was there to talk about slavery, but in his message, the one thing that he kept saying over and over and over again is the truth is in the ground. If you want to know how the slaves lived and died and where they lived and died, the truth is in the ground. He was talking about archaeology, but now I'm thinking burial records and slave cemeteries, that is where I need to go to find information. So I lost really track of what he was talking about because I'm processing now how this can help me find my ancestors. But next. So this is a death record. Actually, the Connecticut Historical Society helped me find this, and it is the death record of a relative by the name of George Thompson. And I had gone back and played the recordings that I had of my mom talking, and she was talking about George Thompson. And so I knew this to be a match because of the names. And so one evening, Rose and I are talking, and I'm saying, you know, I'm just so troubled by Delia. And, you know, I just felt that Delia had her facial, everything about Delia's expression said to me trauma. So I always worried about what happened to Delia and where was she buried. And so I was talking with Rose again, and I said, I gotta find where Delia is buried. And she said, she had seen Delia, a document on Delia in connection with a George Thompson. I said, that's a match. I have a relative, George Thompson. And so then I said, I have his death record. And so she said, text it to me. And I texted it to her, and she texts me back, oh my God. And I text her back, oh my God, what? But ultimately I called her and I'm like, what, Rose? And she said, George Thompson lived and died in Ockertown. And I said, yes. And she said, and he's buried in the Child Cemetery. And yes. She said, Arthurtown is land that is owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And I'm like, oh my God, Rose, how do you know this? And if you go to the next slide, you see, she said Arthurtown was land that was purchased by her family, and that her family established Arthurtown. And I'm like, oh my God, Rose, how can we prove this? And she said, I have the deed. So she texts me the deed, and she texts me this document as well. And the deed shows the transfer from Benjamin Franklin Taylor's widow to her family. And so when and I don't know if I've said this yet, but I probably can't say it enough. The impossibility of some of the information that I was able to access, just I say that God put people in my path and information at my fingertips, because when I think of the impossibility of finding, Rose and I met through contacts on the internet, joining genealogical sites. And I think of all the trillions or many, many millions of people that I could meet on the internet. The one person in the world who could have looked at that George Thompson death record and made the connection was Rose. And not even anyone else in her family, because she is the genealogical searcher and researcher. And, you know, there is nobody else, I believe, in the world that could have looked at that document and made that distinction or made that revelation but Rose. And I met her on the internet, and it's just, to me, that's just miraculous. But this, and then, you know, she has the smoking gun, she had the document. So at this point I knew that, you know, I have definitively linked my Renty, my Papa Renty, to the man Papa Renty, because I'm putting his children on the slaveholders' land. And so I knew, despite the many comments by Harvard, that I could never prove that my Renty is the Renty in the daguerreotype, and I could never link my family to the man in the image, that I had done that. And these are just some of the documents. But at this point, it's like, I'm now looking at Harvard saying, I need you to, as opposed to telling the story about Louis Agassiz as this celebrated scientist, to tell the story about Renty and the rich legacy and the rich history, and, you know, tell his truth, and stop promoting the scientific racist mania of Louis Agassiz. Next. This is a slide. This is Child Cemetery, and the woman next to me is actually restoring. Many of these people were Civil War veterans. And next, if you see the next slide, it's in disrepair. But this is how many slaves were buried. And I remember feeling so bad after visiting this cemetery, because I thought about how slaves had toiled their entire life. And when they died, they were just thrown away as if they didn't exist. And what one of the attorneys who's from this area explained to us, that this yucca plant was usually given as a marker or a headstone for the enslaved, so that there would be something to show that there is a body there. But when you're there at the cemetery, all you see is hundreds of yucca plants and just, weeds. And it was really, really a sad moment for me, because I felt like, it was as if they never existed. And it was really distressing to see that. But, it's important that, again, that we know many of these people, veterans, many of these people, again, lived and died, built the South, and then were thrown away after, a life of servitude. It was a real sad commentary. Next. So I had reached out to Harvard, all of this great stuff. There's now news interest. Many of the major newspapers are writing about the story, and doing further research and developing the story, asking Harvard for comments. And Harvard would say, be very dismissive and very careful language about, oh, it's very hard to prove, you're related, and to prove that this slave is the slave that you're related to, it's next to impossible. And so at this point, Harvard knew my story. And they were having events showing the daguerreotypes. The Peabody Museum was hosting events. And so, but they were continuing to deny my lineage and deny Renty his legacy. This is one of the quotes from Drew Faust, the president of the university at the time, where she says, as it relates to the removal of offensive images, Faust was quoted to say, we do so with the understanding that the school will explore other steps to recognize rather than suppress the realities of its history, mindful of our shared obligations to honor the past, not by seeking to erase it, but rather by bringing it to light and learning from it. And I thought that this was so hypocritical, because here I am telling them who Renty was, and they were suppressing it. They were ignoring it. They were essentially erasing him from history. They would say many times in their presentations that he was invisible, that it's too bad that we don't know anything about the man in the image. And I would literally blow my top. You do so, you know so much about who Renty is. But this is publicly, they would say, we want to learn and we want to grow and we want to embrace it and promote it. But privately, they were suppressing it. Next. And so, yes.
All of the photographs for the Getty series are appropriated images from other historical sources. Harvard threatened to sue me for the use of the first photograph that I showed you. So I thought, Harvard's going to sue me for using these images of Black people in their collection. The richest university in the world. I think that I don't have really a legal case, but maybe I have a moral case that could be made that might be really useful to carry out in public. And so after worrying about it and thinking about it, I called them up and I said, I think actually you're suing me would be a really good thing. You should. And we should have this conversation in court. I think it would be really instructive for any number of reasons, and certainly for artists that are really engaged in the act of appropriation who think that there's a larger story to tell.
I was so inspired when I came across this video, because it confirmed for me that Harvard was exercising dominion and control over these daguerreotypes with an iron fist. If you, they would charge a licensing fee and make you sign this very litigious copyright agreement, knowing that they had no copyright to the images. And if you use them outside of what you agreed to do, they tell you, we will sue you. And so Carrie Mae Weems is an artist who I'm sure you all know, and I don't need to give you the backstory, but she saw these images and they affected her to the degree that she felt like she had to come back and tell this story in an exhibit. And so Harvard, when they confronted that, they threatened to sue her. And I think it was her challenging them that actually got them to back down. And the fact that, the cultural appropriation, the idea, or the goal, I should say, of Harvard to want to control these images, not only the images, but the narrative. And anyone who stepped outside of that narrative, Harvard would threaten them in a way, either legally or professionally. And it was all a part of their, again, exercising that dominion and control over the images. But when she said, I said, go ahead and sue me, that maybe we should have this conversation in court. So now we're talking 2017, 2018, I'm thinking, after almost 7-8 years of trying to get Harvard to embrace Renty as who he was, I'm thinking, okay, now I'm starting to see what's going on here. And maybe perhaps I should talk with an attorney. The next slide. This is, when I talk about the rich story, this is another descendant of Renty. I have not confirmed all of the details, but it talks about this Renty, who was also a carpenter, who was a master carpenter, who built the community of Georgetown, South Carolina. And he was so respected and revered that he, this gentleman wrote a book about him, but the community loved him. This is one of Renty's descendants. Next. And this is just a page that this Renty's mother was Delia. And I'm like, oh my God, when I'm putting pieces together, it's like when I do the genealogical research, it's like, you're kind of shopping and you put something in your cart. And I come across information that I don't quickly put into my cart until I get multiple confirmations. But I saw that Delia, his mother was Delia, but the next slide showed me what I learned was that this person was also enslaved and owned by Annie W. Messick, the same daughter, Benjamin Franklin Taylor's daughter, who my ancestors were enslaved to. So I put that one in my cart. That one was a good match. But he just, again, such rich history. And I thought about Harvard and telling the story and writing books and missing all of this valuable information. Next. This is the book that they published, and it actually it was released in October of last year. And they go on to, they talk about the fact that, it's too bad we don't know anything about these enslaved people in the daguerreotypes. It's too bad that they didn't leave an oral history for us. These are actually things that they said in this book, knowing full well that it wasn't the truth. Next. And this is just here where they talk about, to make their own way in the world is a profound consideration of some of the most challenging images in the history of photography. 15 daguerreotypes of Alfred, Delia, Drana, Facena, Jack, Jim, and Renty, men and women of African descent who were enslaved in South Carolina. They talk about Zealy, but again, they're talking about tracing these people as to where they went and who they are. And they don't mention Papa Renty once in this 600-page book. Next. That, I quickly went over that, and I think it's probably a larger discussion for another day, but I have had many conversations with artists, with photojournalists, with curators, with just members of the public who talk about, well, we have the discussion as to whether or not to show the image, if showing the images creates further harm or further victimizes these already sexually exploited subjects of the daguerreotype. And my response usually, for the most part, has been, I liken it to Emmett Till's mother. And I say to people, if Emmett Till had had a closed casket, the world would never know his name. And I believe that. And I believe that seeing the horror as opposed to hearing about it, helps you to put things into context. It helps you to understand the extent of the inhumanity of the photos as opposed to talking about it. So it's a very delicate balance that I work between the further victimization and the importance of actually seeing the inhumanity of these images. And me personally, what I typically do is I ask if that is something people are comfortable with. If you're still uncomfortable with, we talk about it and we don't show. But the images are graphic. They are, I like to refer to them as, in my mind, the worst examples of men's inhumanity to men, because, you know, and we've seen some horrible pictures, but here, these images and the goal of the daguerreotypes and the goal of this science was to disenfranchise a race. This was about proving not only white supremacy, but Black inferiority, and it stigmatized race as a whole, which impacted not just the slaves and the daguerreotypes, but Black people all over the world. So I see this as a larger sin than just the ugliness of what we see in the images, but where we are now, this is kind of taking us to where we are. Ultimately, through not getting any cooperation from Harvard, I met Attorney Crump, talked to him about my experience. He felt that this was a very reformative case in the sense that it will raise issues that historically have gone unaddressed. And he saw the value in bringing this case against Harvard, and he partnered with Attorney Mike Koskoff, who is of Connecticut and who passed away a year or so ago. But the Koskoff and Crump firm actually filed a brief that I know was heard around the world. And I say that because I've heard from people around the world, but also it just raises so many thorny legal questions that have never been raised legally before. You know, we talk about cultural appropriation, there's repatriation, there's decolonization, there is sexual exploitation and the expropriation of bodies and property. All of these things are kind of encompassed in this complaint. Next. So this is a document that's taken from, this is a page taken from Harvard's one of their briefs. But basically they're saying, irregardless of the circumstances, irregardless of how offensive, how criminal, how abhorrent these images are, their argument is a photo always in every situation belongs to the photographers. And I'll read to you very briefly a line or so. And they're talking about my claim and where it fails. Now, mind you, our complaint is that in 1783, the state of Massachusetts in the Quackwalker case abolished slavery, not only abolished slavery, but gave slaves property interest and property rights. And so when in 1850, Harvard commissioned and acquired these daguerreotypes, they did so illegally against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts law. And so these images and the daguerreotype itself are the plunders of slavery. And the law prohibits that act. And so, and when, you know, we have victims of crime, one of the things we talk about is restitution and how you make them whole, returning their property to them. They had their images taken without their consent. They had the daguerreotypes that were acquired without their consent. So we're asking that the property that should belong to Renty and Delia be returned to them. And I, as the living descendant, am entitled to that property. So Harvard is, their position, they take a different position and not as the tangible daguerreotype, the physical like cell phone image, the little thing that looks like a cell phone. They're talking about photos. And we're talking about the daguerreotypes, which are apples and oranges. But they're saying the photo, irregardless of the circumstances, always belongs to the photographer, which they're not, by the way. And so they also go on to say that the subject of a photo has no interest whatsoever, even if the photo was acquired illegally. They have no interest. And so again, they're taking things out of context, and they're really comparing apples and oranges. And this is the statement: Ms. Lanier's claim fails at the threshold because there is no support for the proposition that a person in any circumstances derives property interest in a physical photograph or painting or sculpture, etc., because the photograph contains the person images. And so in the next slide, they talk about, I might have missed one, but before we go there, I just want to share, Harvard also argues that if I were to prevail, yes, Renty and Delia did not have property interest in the daguerreotypes, and so neither does Miss Lanier, even under our own theory of the case. It is established in common law that the subject of a photograph does not possess property interest in the photography, by virtue of it just being the subject. Rather, the photographer, not just the subject, holds the property interest in the negatives in the printed photograph. The rule encourages freedom of expression consistent with the First Amendment. That rule fully applies to photographs captured in tortious circumstances. That means illegal. Every court has considered the question, has agreed, and for good reason. For civil war, from the Civil War to the Holocaust to images of lynching and prisoners at Abu Ghraib, photographs and gruesome imagery in particular have been used to educate the public, expose corruption, and shock the consciousness in a way that the printed word cannot. Ms. Lanier's proffered rule would deter, even bar, photojournalists and museums from capturing and displaying this imagery, and it would thus undermine the public's strong interest in viewing images of especially during a troubling and historic period. So I share that all to say that what Harvard is arguing currently, that I guess if I am to prevail, that curators, photojournalists, and media professionals alike will not be able to do their job, which I think is really a desperate grasp at a bunch of misinformation and a desperate attempt to invoke the First Amendment to distract the court, because again, they're talking about photography. Our case is not, it's about the tangible property of the daguerreotype. And what we further argue is that, again, these daguerreotypes are the outgrowth of a crime. And it's almost as if Harvard is implying that photojournalists or curators need to resort to criminal acts in order to acquire property. And I know that that's not the case. And so I'll show you the next video. It's a part of our oral argument.
Let me ask you a question about the property right.
Sure.
And that is that as I read the judge's decision, he looked at the counts and he broke them down into the counts that were related to property.
Right.
And basically he ended up saying that he basically, when you look at his reasoning, it is all based on photography. That's what his cases are, and he's finding that a subject has no interest in photography. But my suggestion or question is, what if we don't look at it that way? What if we look at the daguerreotype as an object?
And I think,
Why doesn't that change the analysis?
well, I think some of the cases are about negatives too, and I think the reason it doesn't is because going forward, I mean, obviously the court has to think about what the consequences of the rule that it adopts is, and as the media organization's brief explains, there will be a significant disincentive to museums, news organizations, and the like of displaying to the public some of the most important images of.
Well, counsel, there are systems in place for repatriating remains for Native Americans
Yes.
and their objects.
Yes.
Should there not be, we unfortunately don't have something in place through Congress to do that
Right.
for African Americans
Yeah,
that are descendants.
So
So go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. So that's, I'm very glad you raised that, Your Honor, because I'm not saying there shouldn't be.
Yep, well, that was kind of, but at any rate, this is an image of the family tree starting from Congo Renty. This was printed in the Harvard's Crimson magazine, and they created a tree based on my research from Renty to me and my children, starting with Congo Renty in the far left here, and my children in the far right. And so it shows the direct lineage. And I think the next slide is the end, history denied. And I just put that over Renty's image because his history has been historically denied, and he has a rich history that deserves to be told. The end.
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. That was an absolutely captivating walk through your sort of personal process in bringing this to where it stands today, which, as we know, is still an ongoing case that is under appeal. We had a couple of questions in the chat about where people could find more information about both your case and about Carrie Mae Weems' show. So I dropped a couple of links in there, one to the very recent October 27th hyperallergic article that summed up where things stand with your case right now, and a link directly to the Museum of Modern Art if you are interested in seeing Carrie Mae Weems' work on the subject. We went a little bit over, so we have time for only a few questions, and I have so many to ask you, but the first one I want to ask goes back to the beginning of your presentation. You said your mother always told you to remember that you were African and Indian, and I wonder if you could say something about the Indian part of that heritage.
Wow, yes, and I'm actually working, it's just been an amazing journey, because in doing the research, of course, my mom knew that we were Cherokee Indian. And her elders, and she would talk about her elders and the Native American practices, the practice of medicine and some of the things they would do. So in doing the research, I found my great grandmother on the freedmen's roll. And so so we got our information together and we submitted it to the Cherokee Nation to see what happens. But, you know, just as I said, you know, everything that my mom told me, it's all laid out. She laid out an amazing roadmap that allowed me to trace from where I am today back to that man in 1850, Papa Renty.
Which is incredible. And as you say, like the number of elements that had to fall into place to have all of those documents still recorded. I mean, I think there are plenty of families of, you know, white European ancestry that would not, they would hit that wall that you describe and not have this gift of oral history and then the documents to back it up. So that is an extraordinary, you know, serendipitous event that happened.
Yeah. And, you know, in doing the research, it's really, I feel like an adoptive child looking for my family, you know, because, you know, sometimes when I'm working with the census information, like in some of my other ancestors, I see them in one census, but they're not anywhere in the census before. Now they're adults, so they should be 10 years previously, and they're just simply nowhere to be found. And you know, and I say, you know, just like with the cemetery, it just points to the devaluing of Black life at that time, that they didn't matter. And when I'm in the probate records of the slaveholders, I'm reading through families, and then I get to pigs and cows and livestock. And then I get to more enslaved people. And so it's just, you know, I can't even begin to explain what that feels like. And, you know, like, it's just a feeling of loss. And, yeah.
And you had mentioned in your presentation that you hope to find Delia's burial place. Is that something you've been able to do?
Well, I believe I found her. I'm not sure. But I found her, it's actually, it was a slave insane asylum. And it was where slaves were there being treated and then buried. And so I'm like, okay, I want, and I will just take a trip and go. And so talking to her, she says, I wouldn't encourage you to do that. She said, because they put a golf course over this slave burial ground. And so I didn't go because I knew how that would make me feel, again, about the devaluing of Black lives. And, you know, we know this to be a slave burial ground, and you choose to build a golf course over the top of it. So, yeah, but I say that only because I believe somehow, and her name, the woman's name changed from Taylor to Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs is the doctor who facilitated the taking of the images. My mother also has a cousin who is 98 years old, I believe. She may be closer to 99, but her name is B. Gibbs. So my mother has cousins who are also named Gibbs. So I believe that some of the Taylor enslaved people were either given to Dr. Gibbs as maybe payment for a debt or something, but I believe that may be Delia in that slave cemetery that showed not only it was for people who have had trauma or some form of mental illness, but I can't help but think, you know, like I said, looking at Delia, one of the things that troubled me is the tear that was in the corner of her eye when she was forced to disrobe and be a part of this scientific study. But just how that scenario played out in her relationship with her father, to be paraded in under those circumstances and forced to disrobe, men forced to disrobe, just traumatic. And to me, it looks like Delia led a tragic life. And then when I find her there, it kind of cements for me that is the Delia. A lot of things point to it, and I'm not really ready to put that in my cart, you know, as a definite match, but I believe that is Delia. But I won't go see it.
Understood. If I can ask you one more question, if we look to the future and we see, let's say, an outcome of the case with Harvard, which might result in the return of these daguerreotypes to you and your family, what would you do with them? Where would you keep them? How would they be incorporated into your life?
Yeah, the one thing that is important, and you know, I want to do what's best for not only Papa Renty and the children that descended from him, but I want them to be where it's best to tell their story. One of the things I love about Georgetown, South Carolina, is reading about all of these amazing spaces that his children built. That's also the home of the new well, I think will soon to be open Afro-American Museum that's coming up in Charleston, South Carolina. But I want it to be a place that tells their story in the way it should be told, and restores their dignity, their legacy, and celebrates them in a way that they deserve. So wherever that space is, it's got to be a special place.
Well, we will look forward to the developments in this case that is ongoing in your battle with Harvard. And thank you so much, Tammy, for sharing your oral history and your family history with us this evening. We sincerely appreciate it. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone who has been watching, and we will see you at our next event. Have a good evening.